morning, everyone. I'm Hartford Healthcare's Tina Verona. Thank you so much for joining our daily media briefing. Today, we have just a media availability with Dr. Ulysses Wu, Chief Epidemiologist at Hartford Healthcare, on hand to answer all your COVID-19 related questions, plus COVID-19 hospitalization rates across Hartford Healthcare. Are we still trending downward? And then he's also going to provide the latest data on that, and then the impact of the Stealth Omicron variant. So, Dr. Wu, take it away.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining today on a sunny, I had to look outside because I haven't been outside, a sunny Monday. It's probably very cold outside, though. Hope everybody had a good weekend. So let's give some numbers. Let's start with the numbers. So at Bacchus, as of today, January 31st, we had 46. At Charlotte, we had 19. At Hartford, we had 137. At Midstate, we had 38. At St. Vincent's, we had 37. At the Hospital Central Connecticut, we had 44. At Wyndham, we had 7. At Natchog, we had 4. And at Bradley, we had 2. Overall, our numbers are down about 14 as compared to yesterday. And our ventilator patients remain the same, but they are down from our peak of being in the 50s, which was a few weeks ago at this point. This mirrors the northeast trend that is happening at this time. And we do know that other parts of the country are still experiencing some surges, and deaths do unfortunately remain high, not just in the state of Connecticut, but also across the country. Let's see, I think that's pretty much on the numbers. We can talk a little bit about the BA2.
Dr. Wu, just back to the numbers for a second.
Sure.
Is that still at a steady pace? Is that pace consistent with what you were predicting?
Yeah, we've always predicted a long tail, right? So that sawtooth pattern of a long tail that will be up and down every single day or every other day or whatever days it may be. So we've seen that with, for example, the percent positivity. We've seen that with the ICU stays, with our ICU populations as well. And so we do expect a long tail. I think the BA2 will contribute to a certain extent about this, but I think Omicron by itself was going to contribute to a longer tail, especially since we're in the winter season. The good news is that influenza still remains very low at this point. We are picking up other respiratory viruses. But yes, I don't expect this. You know, everybody was predicting a very steep decline. And I think the very important thing to remember is that even though the numbers are coming down very nicely, when you take an overall perspective, they are still remaining very high at this point. So for example, we have a total of 334 patients in the hospital across HHC at this point. That's still high, even though the numbers are down from, you know, the mid 500s. And so even though it's dropped to almost 40%, it's all relative because they're still high. And the mainstay of defense, if we've talked ad nauseum about, still getting vaccinated, still getting boosted. And I should really put the emphasis on getting boosted. I almost said emphasis. There's a movie, I'm sorry, I'm digressing here, but they talked about you're putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. So the emphasis really should be placed on getting boosted at this point, because the studies are clearly showing that this is your protection, not just necessarily against getting Omicron, but from having its main purpose is preventing severe hospitalizations at this point. In terms of the BA2, you're hearing about it a lot in other countries.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that. Yeah, my question is, how will that impact this downward trend? I read an interesting New York Times article saying that while it's not alarming, it could slow down the case decline. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm going to take credit for the New York Times article because, as you know, we've been saying for the last few weeks that this is going to be a long tail, right? This is going to be the long sawtooth pattern. And I would make reference that the BA2 is, although maybe slightly more contagious, is still Omicron by nature. And we always knew that Omicron by nature was going to slow our recovery at this point.
All right, we do have a question coming into the chat. I do invite you to ask all of your questions while we have Dr. Wu available to us. Ask all your COVID-19 related questions while we have him. The first one comes from Jordan Fenster from Hearst Connecticut Media. Why is it called Stealth Omicron? Is that a hyperbole or is it accurate?
So, Jordan, that's a very good question. I'm going to say it is a little bit of hyperbole at this point. Just like we had Deltacron, just like we had Flurona. I mean, so as it tends to be, unfortunately, we live in a very binary society. So it is either a 0 or a 1 at this point. And so Omicron, it may be the stealth Omicron may be slightly more transmissible, seems to be just as dangerous or just as not dangerous, depending on your point of view, but it is somewhat hyperbolic at this point. Omicron by itself, just by its sheer infectivity, has resulted in a large increase in cases and hospitalizations, even though those are still coming down. And so I think what the stealth may refer to is its potential ability to evade detection, either by your own existing immune system or by some of the tests that are out there. But I think a lot of the data needs to be solidified on that. I think that is, I don't want to say that's hyperbolic. I just want to say that there still needs to be research that needs to be put into place about the quote unquote stealth Omicron. But if we called it Omicron 2, let's face it, it's not really as sexy as stealth Omicron. So I think that's why it's been given the name. To me, it's kind of like rehashed Omicron. That's maybe a little better. So that's what I'm going to call it, rehashed Omicron. So.
There we go. We heard it here first. Two
Yes.
questions coming in from Eliza Fawcett at the Hartford Current. The first is, are you encountering any issues obtaining Paxlovid?
So, yeah, so Eliza, that's a really good question, because it's like everything in COVID, it is all a matter of perspective. We've talked about maintaining your perspective with COVID and how COVID has given us a new perspective on things like influenza and other respiratory viruses. So I will say this from a perspective standpoint. We have not had any issues obtaining Paxlovid, but that's from the perspective of obtaining it. In general, it's still not available to the general population. And so if you look at it from the lens of that perspective, then yes, it is still difficult to obtain Paxlovid because it is not widely available. But in terms of the hospitals being able to get it and give it to patients, we have not had any problems.
Eliza's second question, do you expect hospitalizations to level out at a certain point or keep declining swiftly?
I don't think they're going to level out. I've been saying it for 2 weeks and I'm going to stand by it. Long sawtooth pattern. That's what we're going to do all the way through February, probably all the way through March. I do not think it's going to level out. And I don't think the hospitalizations have leveled out. I can pull up, I don't have the current CH8 or the state data, but I'm trying to look at our census, the COVID census. You know, we hit a peak around 2,000 and we're down to almost 1,000 at this point. So that's pretty darn good. But again, I'm going to say perspective, 1,000 is still terrible. So I don't think it's going to level out. I think it's going to continue to decline. I'm not going to say swiftly, just prolonged, like the way I talk.
Steady, maybe?
Yeah, depends what mood I'm in.
All right, next question from Tracy O'Shaughnessy, Waterbury Republican American. When you talked about the studies that demonstrate the value of boosters, could you quantify that?
Yeah, so the best thing to quantify with regards to that is that boosters, 95% reduction in severe hospitalizations. So that's all you kind of really need to know about it. So that was some of the recent stuff. I think there's other things that you could probably quantify it. But again, now I'm going to be binary. I'm just going to say boosters good, not boosted bad.
Question from Dan Haar, Hearst, Connecticut Media. Follow up to Eliza's question. How many courses of Paxlovid has Hartford Healthcare received and how many has the system prescribed?
Ooh, very good question. I would probably have to look through my emails very quickly to have the exact numbers for you. But all I can tell you is that we are certainly giving Paxlovid from, let's see what I got. I'm sorry, I don't have an update for you. I'm sorry, Dan. So all I can say is that we have received Paxlovid. We are not in a shortage right now, but we are fairly strict with the criteria, but we have opened up that criteria in the last 10 days. So I'm sorry, I wish I I would be giving you false numbers if I even guessed at them, but we are prescribing them. The biggest rate limiting factor when it comes to Paxlovid is getting these patients the medicine within 5 days, which is what we have to do. And then we also have to look at a lot of the drug interactions, since it may have some drug interactions. So sorry, Dan, I don't have the exact numbers.
Follow-up question from Tracy. More countries and public officials are talking about, quote, living with COVID. Could you talk about what that should mean from your perspective and what you think that means about the ways people are behaving?
So, wow, I'm very, I guess, clairvoyant with my long drawn out sawtooth speeches, in the sense that I'm going to say we shouldn't be binary. So living with COVID is, I think, the best way to approach this. And at Hartford Healthcare, that is what we are doing right now. We are trying to figure out how to, quote unquote, live with COVID. How do we coexist with this disease that is probably not going to go away completely, and will continue to remain in circulation, whether it be at a very high level during the winter or at a very low level if we don't have any variants during the summer, because it still causes some logistics in how, I shouldn't say it causes logistics, it changes how we proceed with our logistics in dealing with these patients with regards to in the hospitalization. So you can tell that we've already shifted to living with COVID by our setup of the COVID outpatient triage clinic. We're shifting the battle from the inpatient and shifting it to the outpatient world. So that is one of the things that we're trying to do to combat living, quote unquote, with COVID. And so I would say, going back to my previous thing that I had talked about, we shouldn't be binary about this. It shouldn't be 0 or it shouldn't be 1, just like what is happening in everything else, whether it be politics, whether it be, who has the best pizza. It's either good pizza, it's terrible pizza. Everything is becoming binary. Living with COVID should not be binary at this point, because there are going to be in-betweens. There are certain absolutes that we need to talk about, which is boosting. Boosting is an absolute, so we can take that as a binary. But masking, for example, has become gray. Do we need to mask in every situation? No. I've been saying for a few months now that outdoor masking, probably not as important as indoor masking. We talk about gatherings. There are some people that are very binary about it. They're either everybody can gather or nobody should gather. And then there's the whole group that's in between. So living with COVID, I'm going to say that from a behavior perspective, it's going to be very gray, but gray is good because that gives us options how we should behave. Because you're asking specifically, how should people behave in certain situations? And all I'm going to say to answer that question is don't be binary. Approach it from what the situation calls for.
And her follow-up question, could you talk about the contraindications of Paxlovid? It's not right for everyone, right? People on certain drugs should not take it. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I can't give you the whole laundry list of drugs that people should not get with it, but it is metabolized within the body by other enzymes that may metabolize other drugs. And so Paxlovid may increase the life of those other drugs and cause it to accumulate within your body, or they may decrease the life and render it less effective. And so, yes, you are correct. It is not for everybody, but even if you are on some of those drugs can actually be managed. For example, we'll stop certain drugs that are not essential to be taken every single day if you're going to take a short 5-day course of Paxlovid.
All right, I don't see any other questions in the chat. Not too many questions today. If you have questions, please write them in the chat while we have Dr. Wu available. And Dr. Wu, while we may get some other questions, any final thoughts for the group in terms of where we are right now?
Yeah, I think Tracy stole my thunder talking about living with COVID, because I think that's what we've been trying to do, how we shift Hartford Healthcare, how we are best able to benefit not only our patients, because our patients are obviously the most important population that we have to deal with, but also those who still work here and those who we interact with as well. Because the norm can't be running around with your hair on fire and trying to put out other fires while your own hair is on fire. So we need to preemptively deal with a lot of how we deal with COVID. And like I said, the COVID outpatient triage clinic is a very good thing that represents this. The more people we treat on the outside, the less people that show up on the inside. I cannot quantify all of the thousands of patients that we've infused with monoclonals and the hundreds that we've given paxlovid or molnupiravir, how many have showed up in the hospital, but we know that that is exceedingly uncommon. And so I think in summary, I'm going to give, again, the glass is half full look. Actually, I'm going to say it's like 60% full. So it's not even half full. Like there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Now, I will be the downer here and say that our biggest threat right now will be being unvaccinated, being unboosted, and then also the presence of variants. We do know when Dr. Hotez talked last week that the presence of an unvaccinated population is most likely to generate variants. And so when the other hemisphere, such as the Southern hemisphere in the winter, when we are in our summer, if they are largely in part unvaccinated, there is also the potential of a variance to come out of that region, possibly, and thus show up on our doorstep in the late summer as well. So unboosted, unvaccinated, are our enemies. Try saying that 5 times fast. But along with that, as you know, misinformation is probably even a bigger enemy because it certainly has resulted in a lot of deaths. Not that I'm in the habit of listening to Joe Rogan or talking about Joe Rogan, but you may have seen the news with him and Spotify and Neil Young pulling his songs from Spotify and Joe Rogan issuing an apology and saying that he needs to do a better job in terms of the information that he spreads. You know, that's a good starting point. That means he's not being binary. That means he's not being a 0 or 1. And that's really the only way to combat this going forward. And so I guess those are my final thoughts, and I'll step off of my soapbox right now.
Tracy does have a clarifying question, mentioned that 40% reduction in hospitalizations. Since when?
So Tracy, you're making me do math in my head. So I'm going to say, just in general, we peaked, I think, in the state on January 11th at 1,920, and we're at about 1,136 as of Friday, which I expect to be a lot lower. So those are the numbers. That's over a period of just 17 days. So that's pretty good.
And Dr. Wu, while we have everyone, where do we stand with flu?
Oh, flu. Again, knock on wood, I don't want to say that flu is gone because we're certainly still seeing flu as well as other respiratory viruses. But the flu numbers look pretty good right now. In terms of actual numbers for the states, oh boy, you're all asking these hard questions at this point. We have 3, as of Friday, we have 3 that were hospitalized with influenza. And then we had 1 that was in the ICU. That's in the state, not for Hartford Healthcare. For Hartford Healthcare, in the week from January 23rd to January 30th, we only actually had 2 influenza cases that we picked up.
That's great. Those are good numbers. Speaking of numbers, I know we keep going back to numbers, but with testing, so on this downward trend that we're seeing, do you anticipate testing numbers to go up, level off, or decrease while we're in this trend?
Tina, you're asking me to make more predictions. I think as we tend to become a binary society and as COVID starts fading from our collective consciousness, I would expect testing to go down. I think we're going to see bumps. We're going to see bumps around, say, school, return to schools. Not that that's happening right now. Camps, we're going to see, for example, a lot of testing that's going to be ramped up. People who are traveling. So if there's spring break, testing is going to be required for a lot of that. So I think overall it's going to be down, but we're certainly going to see spikes as well.
One last question from Tracy. Have your site seen any increase in first vaccines or boosters since Omicron arrived?
I'm going to be honest with you. Our first vaccination rate has not really changed all that much. And I'm disappointed in not just our booster level, but across the country. Boosters certainly it's not up to par that we would want it to be. We certainly saw an increase in boosters when Omicron first arrived, but with numbers getting better, and I've said this, I think, a year ago on some of these things, When numbers get better, vaccinations tend to go down, unfortunately. And that is our biggest fear for this time next year in October, that we're going to have a large unvaccinated or unboosted population at this point.
All right, so the main takeaway, still trending downward, so things are on the up and up. So we like that. Thanks, Dr. Wu. I appreciate it. And thank you all for watching and asking your questions today. And we will be in touch when our next media briefing is. So thank you all again for joining us and have a great day. Be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.